Hi, it's Chris. Welcome to an Azure Masterclass episode all about the different VM SKUs that you can purchase in Azure. As we all know, VMs offer a range of different sizes. So we've got things like CPU, RAM, and we have storage too. And that's the same whether it's on-prem or in Azure. Now, most of the stuff in Azure scales CPU in a sort of linear fashion, just like it does with RAM. Storage, we'll get onto, it's a little bit different. There's different types of machines and different classifications and different SKUs. So in Azure, we have things like our general purpose, compute-optimized, memory-optimised, storage-optimised, GPU and high-performance compute. All of these will scale their CPU at RAM at different ratios. For example, 4 CPUs, 8 gig of RAM, or 4 CPUs, 16 gig of RAM. If it's more compute intensive, you'll have less RAM, more CPUs. If it's memory intensive, you'll have more RAM per CPU core. So for the majority of customer deployments for generalist VMs, we're typically going to go in the general category of VM. For things like SQL, we might start to get into memory, specific SKUs where there's a higher ratio of memory to CPU cores. Now, when it comes to storage, you've got standard HDD, standard SSD, and also premium SSD. Now, the difference between all these is performance. So next we have premium SSD V2, which enables more features and slightly higher performance. Hopefully I'm right, but that's a 32 terabyte. It's actually TIB max, so this is a 64 terabyte max. So on premium SSD, max IOPS is 20K, and the max IOPS here is 80K. So there's a significant performance improvement by moving to premium SSD V2. But of course, with that becomes more expenditure, higher costs. In the memory optimized category, the VM that we were actually talking about was the EV series. First, if you look here, for example, these are different specs for all different machines. And one thing that's important to point out is just because your workload needs 2 cores, for example, doesn't mean that you'll actually need that spec machine. And what I mean by that is that actually you might end up having to go a higher core count to get the disk throughput that you actually need to achieve. This E series is probably a bad example, but if you decided actually my workload needs 2 cores based on like a sizing exercise that I've done, you can see here that this workload, so this E2S V5 machine, if you went with a 2-core version because that's what you decided you need in terms of like CPU performance, actually you'd only get 3,750 IOPS. And now most like workloads that are like very database intensive are going to need a higher amount of performance. Now the other thing is there's lots of different letters and numbers like a D2S. D is the machine series, so that's like the classification. D would be general. 2 is 2 CPU cores, and S means it supports premium storage. Then there's all sorts of other letters, like for example, A is AMD processors, P is a temp disk. So you might actually be in the realm of needing a 16S. The S means that there's support for premium SSD drives in particular. This machine here, the E16S V5, we can see here that's giving us 25,600 IOPS versus the 3,750. And the other thing to point out, of course, is that this machine here only supports 4 data disks. So if you want to separate your like SQL databases, your logs, your master DB, and your backups, you're going to be at pretty much the cap there. But then you've also got the OS disk to think about. Now, another thing that a lot of people don't know is obviously SQL uses a lot of CPU. So if we just wipe this off, cue video skip mode. So when it comes to compute SKUs, obviously for workloads like SQL, we might want something that's more memory optimized and has less CPU cores. But also we might want a certain amount of VM performance because of course, certain VM SKUs have different layers of performance. So for example, the E16, it's got 16 cores. There'll be things such as max disks, IOPS, network throughput, features. What becomes a bit of an issue is you might want a certain amount of disks, a certain amount of IOPS, a certain amount of throughput, and that might lead you to have to use the E16 SKU. So what Azure actually provide is a constrained core count version. What they do is they keep all the same performance characteristics of their higher core count brother in terms of IOPS and disk performance and disk count. But what they actually do is they reduce the CPU cores, which means for things like SQL, you're going to save quite a bit of money. So you're getting all these great pieces of performance. However, instead of being 16 cores, it's 4, which means that you're only paying for 4 cores of SQL. And because they've only got 4 cores, keeps the cost down. One last thing to mention while we're on VM names and configurations, you'll notice that a lot of machines have a V, like V4 or V5 or V2. That is the generation of machine denoted by the type of processor it's using behind the scenes. It's normally always best to go with the latest version of that machine because you're going to get access to the latest technology. It's often the same price or less. So if we look at these constrained CPU capable machines, for example, the E16 4SV4, if that was a 16 core machine, we'd be at 16 cores of SQL licensing. Whereas on an E16 4S, we're getting the performance of that SKU without the CPU cores. So we're keeping the same disk performance, the same network performance, but we're only having 4 cores of CPU. There's some useful things on the Azure learn.microsoft.com in terms of like benchmarks for different machines. As I sort of said, most workload is going to sit around DC series machines. Don't tend to use B series, which are burstable machines in production use, because you can't get guaranteed performance. You might end up with some F workloads. F machines have a slightly higher CPU count. They suit slightly more CPU intensive workloads. And then memory optimized machines, really great for like SQL. Again, like you've got GPU, if you want to do like GPU enabled machines for processing, you've got that option as well. Hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea in terms of the different options you've got in Azure VM sizes, because it can be quite confusing, particularly when everything's got like a million letters after its name. But yeah, this page is the absolute go-to. And as I've said, you're mainly going to be working like D series, F series and E series machines for the majority of enterprise workloads. So I hope today's video has been useful. Subscribe to our channel and keep a lookout for our next Azure Masterclass, episode 4, coming soon.